History is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is a compass they use to find themselves on the map of human geography. History tells a people who they are and where they are. But more importantly, it tells them where they still must go and what they still must do. Dr. John Henrik Clark.
The history of African people is one of the most consistently distorted histories of any people on Earth. False narratives of Africa as a dark continent and notions of slavery civilizing millions of Africans are dangerous myths which have persisted for more than 500 years. These myths must be destroyed and replaced with documented truths that place Africans where they belong in the forefront of human accomplishments. Without tearing anyone down, we must lift ourselves up. We must tell the truth, teach the truth, and let the truth speak for itself. This is the mission of the John Henrik Clarke Enhanced History Project. Dr. Clark was a historian who passionately stressed the importance of the study of history. Dr. Clark espoused the philosophy that history is the clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. Clark said that history tells the people where they have been and what they have been, what they are and where they are. The most important role of history, however, is to tell a people where they still must go and what they still must do. Dr. Clark's understanding of African history and world history was shaped by three scholars: Arthur Schomburg of the Harlem Library, Willis N. Huggins, and John Jackson of the Harlem History Club. Once his historical and cultural memory were restored, Clark went on to teach and serve others for over half a century. Clark was an advisor to Kwame Nkrumah and Malcolm X, whose leadership inspired millions around the world. And he taught thousands of students in classrooms at Hunter College in New York and around the world. Dr. Clark founded and led several organizations that shaped and defined the Black Studies movement of the 1960s. He was a founding member of the African Heritage Studies Association and the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization. Although he transitioned in 1998, Dr. Clark's spirit lives on through the works of those he inspired. One of the most important lessons Dr. Clark stressed is that the history of Africans did not begin in slavery. And thanks to the teachings of Dr. Clark, we now know that if the history of African people were a book of 1,000 pages, the story of our enslavement would begin on page 996 and would only be 2 pages long. With this as its guiding principle, the John Henrik Clarke Enhanced History Project was curated to tell the story of the first 995 pages of African and African American history. The John Henrik Clarke Enhanced History Project was founded on 4 fundamental truths. They are scientific and historical facts which prove, 1, that Africa was the birthplace of humanity, and that multiple migrations out of Africa resulted in humans populating the entire planet. Genetic evidence has shown that every person on Earth is a descendant of an African man and an African woman. The oldest and largest archive of human accomplishments, writing, agriculture, art, architecture, government, astronomy, and technology, have been found in abundance throughout the Nile Valley. The Nile Valley cultures that developed in ancient Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt have influenced and transformed cultures around the world for more than 8,000 years. These 4 fundamental truths are illustrated in the 25-foot-long African EYES Mural, which documents 8,000 years of African excellence and success. This incredible journey began in the Nile Valley and spread from the Nile to the Niger rivers, across the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi, Potomac rivers, and beyond. The mural divides African history into 8 epochs, which depict achievements in the Nile Valley, West Africa, and North America. The first epoch represents the cosmos. Many ancient civilizations have origin stories that begin with myths associated with creative forces within the cosmos. The cosmos is commonly referred to today as space, the heavens, or the multiverse. In ancient African mythology, this celestial environment was the dominion of 2 feminine aspects of creation, Ma'at and Nut. Ma'at encompasses the entire cosmos. She embodied principles associated with truth, justice, righteousness, balance, harmony, order, and reciprocity, which govern every aspect of existence. Today, the principles of Ma'at endure in concepts such as above, so below, what goes around comes around, and you reap what you sow. Ma'at represents the principles one needed to embrace in order to live a righteous life. The image of Ma'at is the very first depiction of a human being with wings. This is a figure which we now refer to as an angel. Nut, the second feminine aspect of creation, represents the Milky Way galaxy. She regulates the movement of the sun, stars, and planets within our solar system. Nut was depicted as the personification of the sky and the environment where the annual cycles of time, the sun, moon, and stars, could be observed and documented. From countless observations of the sky, ancient African astronomers divided the day into 24 hours, the year into 365 days, and the circle into 360 degrees. The knowledge of Ma'at and Nut was recorded by Sheshet, the third member of this cosmic triumvirate. Sheshet brought the knowledge of the cosmos to Earth and imparted it to her husband Jehuti, who shared it with the inhabitants along the Nile. The wisdom of Jehuti, revealed to humans, resulted in numerous technological advancements. The second epoch is represented by Mir and Tekhenu, which are known today as pyramids and obelisks. These architectural structures embody the wisdom of Jehuti, employed by ancient people of Nabta and Tarseti, who gave birth to Nile Valley civilization over 6,000 years ago. Mir and Tekhenu are associated with Asar and Aset, the mythological founders of Kemet, or Egypt. Asar and Aset were associated with 2 star systems in the Milky Way galaxy. Asar represented the constellation Sahu, and Aset was associated with the binary star system Septet. We are more familiar with Asar and Aset by their Greek names Osiris and Isis, and we now call Sahu Orion and Septet Sirius. Sahu and Septet represented processes of rebirth and renewal based on an analysis of Nabta, the oldest astroarchaeological calendar in existence. Nabta is comprised of about 24 stones and was built near the border of ancient Egypt and Sudan more than 7,000 years ago. The third epoch of the mural is a depiction of Ipet Isut, the largest temple and educational facility in history. 4,000 years ago, Waset was the cultural and spiritual capital of Kemet, and Ipet Isut was the residence of Amen, the unseen presence of God Almighty. During the 18th and 19th dynasties, approximately 1500 to 1100 BCE, 83,000 priests and priestesses of Amen worked in Ipet Isut. During this period, the city of Waset boasted more than 1,400 statues of its king standing in front of ram-headed figures which represented Amen. These statues symbolize the unseen presence of God protecting the king, who in turn protected the people of Kemet. After Arabs conquered Egypt in the 7th century, they renamed Ipet Isut Karnak and renamed Waset Luxor. The mural's fourth epoch represents the royal Mir of Kush. Did you know that there are more Mir pyramids in Kush than there are in Kemet? There are 118 pyramids in Egypt, and over 400 pyramids have been found in Sudan, ancient Kush, or Nubia. Approximately 2,700 years ago, Kushite kings established the 25th dynasty in Kemet, and they restored temples and monuments throughout the country. This is the first documented Renaissance in history, and it represented an effort by Kushite kings in the 7th century BCE to restore their ancestral homeland in Kemet. The civilization of Kush continued to thrive long after the fall of Kemet, and it holds the distinction of being the longest continuously existing kingdom in the Nile Valley. The fifth epoch is represented by the Olmec civilization. This culture was established in the Americas by African explorers from the Nile Valley who made multiple trips across the Atlantic between 1200 and 400 BCE. These African explorers were known by the indigenous people as the Olmec. Based on the available physical evidence, we can say definitively that the Olmecs visited the New World 2,500 years before the birth of Christopher Columbus. Over 20 carved heads of Olmec leaders were found in the ruins of ancient temples and pyramids throughout Mexico during the early 20th century. Many of the Olmec heads have distinct African features. One has cornrows, and another wears a helmet similar to the helmets worn by Nubian soldiers in the 6th century BCE. This history was documented by Dr. Ivan van Sertima in his 1976 publication, They Came Before Columbus, The African Presence in America. The sixth epoch is depicted by the Sankore Mosque in Timbuktu. This culturally rich educational center in Mali grew out of the knowledge brought into West Africa by scholars, scientists, philosophers, and intellectuals from the Nile Valley. There is evidence of 6 migrations from East Africa to West Africa, which occurred between the 6th century BCE and the 6th century ACE. We also know that by 1450, the University of Sankore, its great library and grand mosques, were populated by 25,000 scholars, many of whom had studied in Egypt and Mecca. This great center of learning was similar to those developed at Ipet Isut in the 13th century BCE and the Library and University of Alexandria, Egypt in the 1st century AD. There were multiple centers of learning throughout Africa, and foreigners from Southern Europe and Western Asia traveled to these educational facilities and returned home with knowledge which transformed their worlds. The history of Africa as a vast center of learning was erased during the Arab and European slave trade and the subsequent colonization of the African continent. The seventh epoch references the Maafa, the great disaster which disrupted the lives of hundreds of millions of Africans during the slave trade. The Arab trans-Saharan slave trade lasted more than 1,300 years, from the 7th century until the 20th century. The European and American transatlantic slave trade lasted almost 500 years, from 1444 until 1888, and the European colonization of Africa lasted from 1885 until the 1990s. In a contemporary sense, the Maafa was a drive-by on Africa, and colonization was the equivalent of gentrification. The African continent has yet to recover from this 2,000-year-old assault on its land, its people, and its resources. People of African descent in the Americas are the survivors of the Maafa. Our ancestors were stolen from West Africa. They survived the Middle Passage and were enslaved throughout the New World. Thus, Africans in the diaspora are the descendants of African ancestors who survived the greatest hardships the world has ever known. According to the African Union, diasporic Africans in the Americas represent the 6th region of Africa and comprise more than 140 million people. African Americans today are encouraged to engage in acts of Sankofa, and retrieve the knowledge of their African ancestors. This intergenerational transference of knowledge was banned during enslavement and has been marginalized since emancipation in 1865. We proudly share this history today in honor of the millions of souls who were denied the right to retain their historical and cultural traditions. The eighth epoch is devoted to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The museum begins its narrative with the enslavement of Africans in colonial America. The Clarke Enhanced History Project explores the rich history of African people prior to European and Arab enslavement. It was curated to be experienced prior to visiting the National Museum of African American History and Culture and provides context of the museum's exhibition and the early history of Africans in North America. Armed with knowledge of Africa prior to the Maafa, visitors to the museum will have a more meaningful and transformative experience. Our interpretation of the architecture and historical significance of the museum is inspired by my work on ancient Egyptian influences on the design and development of Washington, D.C., and explored through the Egypt on the Potomac field trip. When examined within the framework of Egypt on the Potomac, one can see the architectural features of the National Museum of African American History and Culture references the migration of Africans from the Nile to the Niger to the Potomac. The museum was designed by a team of African and African-British architects. The bronze-colored exterior of the museum is called the corona. It was designed by David Ajay and adorns the building like a crown. The shape of the corona was inspired by the headdress of a Yoruba shrine post found in an ancestral shrine house in Nigeria. An actual Yoruba shrine post greets visitors at the entrance to the cultural galleries on the 4th floor. David Ajay was intentional about every element incorporated in the design of the corona. The slope of the corona forms an angle of 17 degrees, which corresponds perfectly to the 73-degree angle of the capstone of the Washington Monument located directly across the street. This geometric correlation implies geographical connections between East and West Africa and Washington, D.C. Thus, the corona of the National Museum of African American History and Culture draws on East and West African architectural structures and colonial American heraldry and architecture. This symbolism is too stark to ignore or dismiss as a coincidence. Another unique architectural feature of the National Museum is the oculus, which is near the 15th Street and Constitution Avenue entrance of the museum. The oculus is a circular stone bench surrounding a raised glass enclosure. In traditional architectural design, an oculus is an opening in the dome of a temple. Traditionally, it represented the eye of God observing all of the activities within a building. The oculus at the National Museum of African American History and Culture is strategically placed directly above the contemplative court, which is located on the concourse or basement level of the museum. Entrance to the history galleries is also found on the concourse level. These history galleries house 60% of the exhibitions within the museum, and they occupy 3 levels of the sub-basement 60 feet below the concourse and the contemplative court. Exhibitions in the history galleries are highly effective in depicting the horrors and indignities of the Middle Passage, enslavement, emancipation, Jim Crow, civil rights. Visitors exiting the history galleries are encouraged to rest, reflect, and recharge in the contemplative court before visiting the upper floors of the museum. When entering the contemplative court, visitors hear the sound of falling water and see sunlight streaming into the room from the glass oculus in the ceiling. These sights and sounds have a welcoming and calming effect on all who enter the room, making the contemplative court the perfect place to rest, reflect, and recharge. The African-American architects Philip Freelon and Max Bond designed the oculus and the contemplative court to make a subtle and profound historical statement. Freelon and Bond erected their oculus at the site of a former slave auction block. It is a sobering sight for those in the contemplative court to see tears flowing from the oculus, the eye of God, at the site where an untold number of African families shed tears as families were separated and sold into bondage. Experiencing the Henrik Clarke Enhanced History Project and the Egypt on the Potomac field trip of Washington, D.C. are important precursors for an enhanced visit to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. These culturally curated activities were designed to fulfill the vision of Listervelt Middleton, host of the television program For the People. Listervelt often reminded his viewers that minute by minute, hour by hour, as you lose your history, you lose your power. So sharpen your eyes and tune your ears so you'll know what you see and understand what you hear. In closing, if history is the clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day, it can be said that the clock of African history has been broken for more than 1,800 years. And we are obligated to train horologists to reach back in time and create a new chronology of African history in order to reset the clock of destiny for people of African ancestry. If history is the compass that people use to find themselves, we must orient ourselves towards Sankofa and restore that which has been forgotten in order to create a world of limitless possibilities for the generations that will follow us. With the resetting of your historical clock and the use of a cultural compass that points in a new direction, African Americans will come to know and understand that what our ancestors have done in the past, we can replicate in the present and perpetuate into the future for the generations to come.